The trucks came before the sun had fully risen, and the sound of their engines rolled through the quiet streets like distant thunder. Clara Whitfield had just stepped out of the hospital's side entrance, her sneakers pressing into the wet gravel of the parking lot, when the first vehicle turned the corner. She stopped walking. Something about the sight froze her in place. 3 green trucks, followed by 2 black vehicles, moved slowly down Miller Street, the same street she had walked 1,000 times without a second thought. For a moment she told herself it was nothing, maybe a training exercise, maybe a detour from the highway, but her hands, still faintly smelling of hospital soap, tightened around the strap of her bag. Something in her chest told her this was not ordinary. She had just finished a 14-hour shift in the intensive care unit, the kind of shift that drains a person down to the bone. Her feet ached. Her eyes were heavy. She wanted nothing more than to go home, make a cup of tea, and check on her son before he left for school. But instead, she stood frozen at the edge of the parking lot, watching uniformed men climb out of the trucks with sharp, practiced movements. People on the sidewalk had also stopped. A woman walking her dog paused mid-step. 2 teenagers on their way to school slowed down, phones lifted, unsure whether to record or run. Harold Finch, who owned the little grocery store on the corner, stepped out from behind his counter and stood in his doorway, wiping his hands on his apron, squinting at the convoy as if trying to make sense of a puzzle that did not belong in his small town. Clara's town was not the kind of place where anything dramatic happened. It was a town of quiet mornings, familiar faces, and slow afternoons. The biggest news in the past year had been a mild flood near the river and the retirement of the old postmaster. Nothing about this town suggested that a line of military vehicles should ever roll through its streets. She thought about turning around and going back inside the hospital, telling herself that whatever this was, it had nothing to do with her. But her legs did not move. Instead, she watched as one of the black vehicles slowed to a stop, directly across from where she stood. The door opened, and a tall man in a crisp uniform stepped out, his boots landing firmly on the pavement. He looked around the street, his eyes moving from building to building, before finally settling on her. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. Then he began walking toward her, his pace steady, unreadable. Clara's mind raced through every possible reason a soldier would be looking for her. Had something happened to a patient's family member who served overseas? Was this related to some paperwork mix-up from the hospital? She had no children in the military. Her late husband had never served. She could not think of a single reason this man would be walking straight toward her with such purpose. "Are you Clara Whitfield?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. She nodded, unable to find her voice at first. "Yes," she finally said. "That's me." The man studied her face for a long moment, as if confirming something he already suspected. Then, without warning, he turned slightly and raised his hand toward the trucks behind him. One by one, the doors of the vehicles opened, and soldiers began stepping out, forming a loose line along the street. Clara felt her heartbeat quicken. She glanced around at the growing crowd of townspeople, all of them just as confused as she was. "Ma'am," the man said, his tone shifting into something softer, almost reverent. "My name is Captain Nathan Cole. I have been looking for you for a long time." Clara blinked. "I don't understand. Have we met before?" The captain's jaw tightened, and for a brief second, something flickered across his face, something like emotion held carefully in check. "You saved my life," he said, "many years ago, in a place far from here. I don't expect you to remember me. It was chaos back then, and you had so many people to care for, but I never forgot you." The words hit her like a wave. Clara searched her memory, trying to place his face among the thousands of patients she had treated over the years. Nothing came to mind immediately, but a strange, faint feeling stirred inside her, like a door creaking open in a room she had not entered in a long time. Behind Captain Cole, the other soldiers straightened their posture. Without a single word from anyone, they lifted their hands in salute, all facing Clara. The street fell silent except for the soft rustle of morning wind. Even the birds seemed to pause. Harold Finch, still standing in his doorway, dropped the cloth he had been holding. Margaret Hale, an elderly woman who lived 2 houses down from Clara, pressed her hand to her chest, her eyes wide with disbelief. The teenagers who had been recording lowered their phones. their expressions shifting from confusion to something closer to awe. Clara felt her throat tighten. She was used to being the one who comforted others, the one who stayed calm in the middle of chaos. She was not used to being on the receiving end of such attention, especially not from a group of soldiers standing at attention in the middle of her quiet town. "I don't understand," she said again, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm just a nurse." Captain Cole lowered his hand and stepped closer, his expression gentle now, almost fragile beneath the discipline of his uniform. "You are not just anything," he said. "You gave me a second chance at life, and you did it without ever asking for anything in return. I spent years trying to find out who you were, and when I finally did, I promised myself that if I ever got the chance, I would come and thank you properly. Today, that chance finally came." Clara felt tears gathering at the corners of her eyes, though she could not fully explain why. Something about his words felt like a memory trying to surface from a place she had buried long ago. She had cared for so many patients over the years, especially during the years she had spent working far from home, in places where the days blurred together, and sleep became a rare luxury. She had tried not to think about those years too often, not because they were painful, but because they had asked more of her than she thought she had to give. The crowd around them continued to grow. Neighbors stepped out of their homes, drawn by the unusual sight of a nurse standing in the middle of the street, surrounded by soldiers in salute. Whispers spread quickly, passing from one person to another, each version of the story growing slightly different from the last. "Who is she?" someone in the crowd asked. "That's just Clara," another voice answered. "She works at the hospital." "Then why are they saluting her like she's a general?" Clara heard the whispers, but she kept her eyes fixed on Captain Cole, trying to piece together the fragments of memory that his presence had stirred. She could see now, faintly, the shape of a young man's face beneath the mature features standing before her, a face she had once bent over in a dim, crowded room, filled with the sounds of urgent voices and quick footsteps. "I remember treating so many people," she said quietly. "I'm sorry if I don't remember every face." "You don't have to apologize," Cole said. "You gave everything you had to give, every single day. That is more than most people can say." He turned slightly, gesturing toward the soldiers behind him. "These men and women are here because of you too, in one way or another. Word spread through our unit a long time ago about a nurse who never stopped fighting for her patients, even when the odds were against her. Some of them heard the story before they ever met me. Today, we all wanted to be here." Clara's son, Daniel, had just stepped outside their house 2 streets away, backpack slung over one shoulder, when he noticed the unusual quiet in the neighborhood. He walked toward the sound of murmuring voices, weaving through neighbors who had gathered along the sidewalk. When he finally reached the edge of the crowd and saw his mother standing in the middle of the street, surrounded by soldiers, his steps slowed. He had grown up hearing small pieces of his mother's past, vague mentions of years spent working somewhere far away, but she had never spoken about it in detail. Seeing her now, standing quietly under the weight of so many watching eyes, he felt a strange mixture of pride and confusion settle in his chest. Clara caught sight of him through the crowd and gave a small, reassuring nod, though her own heart was still racing. She had spent years keeping her past folded away, tucked neatly behind the routines of ordinary life. She had not expected it to come walking back to her on an ordinary Tuesday morning, wearing a uniform and calling her ma'am. Captain Cole seemed to sense the weight of the moment building around them. He glanced at the crowd, then back at Clara. "I know this must feel overwhelming," he said, "but there is more you need to know. What happened between us was not a small thing, and there are people here today who would like the chance to explain why." Clara felt a chill run through her, not from fear but from the sense that whatever story was about to unfold would reshape everything her neighbors thought they knew about her, and perhaps everything she thought she knew about herself. She glanced once more at the line of soldiers standing silently along the street, still holding their salute, still waiting for her. "All right," she said softly, steadying her voice. "Tell me." The street remained still, holding its breath, as the soldiers waited for their captain to speak, and the town waited to learn the truth about the woman they thought they already knew. Captain Cole turned to the soldier standing closest to him, a young man named Oliver Grant, and gave a small nod. Oliver stepped forward, holding a thin folder against his chest. His hands looked steady, but Clara noticed a slight tremble in his fingers, as though the moment meant something deeply personal to him as well. "Ma'am," Oliver said, his voice carrying the same respectful tone as his captain's, "you probably don't remember me either. I was barely more than a boy back then, brought in during the middle of the night, more scared than hurt. Or so I thought at the time. You were the one who told me I would be fine, even when everyone around us looked like they weren't sure." Clara studied his face, searching for any flicker of recognition. The years had changed him, filled out his shoulders, hardened his jaw, but something about his eyes felt familiar, like a photograph she had seen once, and forgotten the details of. "I'm sorry," she said again, feeling the weight of her own forgetfulness pressing on her chest. There were so many nights like that, so many young men and women who came through those doors. "You don't need to apologize," Oliver said quickly. "None of us expect you to remember every face. What matters is that you were there. You stayed when others would have given up. That's the kind of thing a person doesn't forget, even if the person who did it moves on with her life." The crowd along the street had grown thick by now. More neighbors stepped out of their homes, drawn by the unusual stillness that had settled over Miller Street. Even the town's sheriff, Walter Doyle, arrived on foot, his uniform half-buttoned, clearly having rushed out the moment he heard something unusual was happening near the hospital. Walter approached the edge of the crowd and exchanged a quiet word with Harold Finch, who simply shook his head, unable to explain what he was witnessing. The sheriff's eyes moved toward Clara, then toward the row of soldiers still standing with quiet discipline, and he chose to hang back, sensing that whatever was unfolding needed no interruption from him. Clara felt her son's eyes on her from across the street. She glanced toward him again, offering the smallest smile she could manage, though her mind was spinning with questions she did not yet have the words to ask. "Captain Cole," she said, turning back to him, "you said there was more I needed to know. Please, tell me plainly. What happened back then? Why does it matter so much, all these years later?" Cole exhaled slowly, as if gathering the courage to speak about something he had carried quietly for a long time. "You worked for 2 years in a field hospital, in a place where medical staff were stretched far beyond what any person should be asked to endure. I was brought in one night badly injured, along with several others. The doctors on duty were overwhelmed. There were more patients than hands to help them." He paused, his eyes distant, as though replaying the memory in his mind. "You were exhausted. I remember hearing someone say you had already been awake for almost 2 full days, but when they brought me in, you didn't hesitate. You worked through the night, moving from one patient to another, refusing to rest until every person in that room had been cared for." Clara felt her chest tighten as fragments of memory began stitching themselves together. She remembered nights that blurred into days, remembered the constant hum of machines, remembered voices calling her name from every direction. She had never allowed herself to think too deeply about those years, mostly because doing so meant reliving moments of exhaustion so complete that she sometimes wondered how she had survived them herself. "There was a moment," Cole continued, "when the situation looked very difficult for me. The senior doctor told you there wasn't much more that could be done, that resources needed to go elsewhere, but you refused to accept that. You stayed by my side. You kept working, kept trying, long after anyone would have blamed you for stepping away." Clara's eyes glistened as the memory sharpened. She remembered a young man's face beneath dim lighting, remembered gripping his hand and telling him to keep breathing, to keep fighting, because she was not going to let him give up. She had told herself back then that she had simply done her job. She had never imagined that the boy she spoke to that night would grow into the man standing before her now, wearing a captain's uniform and commanding a unit of his own. "I remember you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I remember your eyes. You kept asking if you were going to make it home to see your family." Cole's composed expression finally cracked, just slightly, his eyes glistening with the same emotion Clara felt rising in her own chest. "You told me I would," he said. "You told me to hold on, and somehow, because of you, I did." The crowd around them had grown almost completely silent, save for a few muffled whispers passing from one person to another. Margaret Hale dabbed at her eyes with the corner of her sleeve. Harold Finch stood with his arms crossed, staring at Clara as though seeing her for the very first time. Daniel pushed gently through the crowd until he stood closer to his mother, though he stayed a respectful few steps back, sensing this moment belonged to her and to the soldiers who had traveled so far to find her. After that night, Cole continued, I never forgot you. I carried your memory with me through every difficult moment that followed. When I finally left that chapter of my life behind and returned home, I promised myself I would find you one day and thank you properly. It took years of searching, following faint records and old paperwork, before I finally learned your name and where you had settled. He gestured toward the soldiers standing behind him. I told my unit about you long before we ever set foot in this town. Some of them had similar stories of their own, nurses and doctors who worked tirelessly during those difficult years, often without recognition. When I finally found where you lived, I asked if they would be willing to come with me. Not as an order, but as a mark of respect. Every single one of them agreed without hesitation. Clara looked past Cole toward the line of soldiers, each one standing with quiet solemnity, and felt a wave of humility wash over her. She had never sought recognition for the work she had done. She had simply believed it was her duty to care for the people placed in front of her, regardless of the circumstances or the toll it took on her own body and mind. I never expected anything like this, she said softly. I did what I thought anyone in my position would do. Not everyone would have done what you did, Cole said firmly. Not everyone could have. You gave more of yourself than most people are capable of giving, night after night, without complaint, without asking for thanks. That is why we are here. That is why this town deserves to know the kind of woman who has been living quietly among them all these years. The crowd murmured with a mixture of admiration and disbelief. Neighbors who had known Clara for years exchanged glances, realizing how little they truly understood about the life she had lived before settling into their quiet town. To them, she had always simply been the nurse who worked long hours at the hospital, who kept to herself, who occasionally shared a kind word or a warm smile, but never spoke much about her past. Margaret Hale stepped forward hesitantly, her voice trembling with emotion. Clara, dear, why did you never tell us any of this? Clara turned to her longtime neighbor, feeling a familiar warmth despite the surreal nature of the morning. It wasn't something I wanted to carry into ordinary conversations, she said. Those years were difficult. I preferred to leave them behind me and focus on building a peaceful life here, for myself and for my son. Daniel, standing nearby, felt a lump form in his throat as he listened to his mother's words. He had always known she carried a quiet strength, evident in the way she handled long shifts and difficult days without complaint, but he had never imagined the depth of what she had endured, nor the lives she had touched so profoundly. Captain Cole turned toward his soldiers once more, addressing them briefly before turning back to Clara. We would like to share more with you, and with this town, about what you did and the difference it made. Not because you asked for recognition, but because silence about such things does a disservice to the truth. Would you allow us to share more? Clara hesitated for a moment, glancing toward her son, then toward her neighbors, all of whom watched her with a mixture of curiosity and quiet respect. She had spent years keeping this chapter of her life private, but standing here now, surrounded by people whose lives she had touched without even realizing the full extent of it, she felt something shift within her. Yes, she said finally, her voice steady despite the emotion swirling beneath it. Tell them everything. Captain Cole nodded, a look of quiet gratitude passing across his face. He turned to address the gathering crowd, his voice carrying clearly across the street, ready to share a story that had remained hidden for far too long, a story that would forever change the way this small town saw the woman they thought they already knew. Captain Cole took a slow breath, gathering his thoughts before he began speaking to the crowd. The street had gone almost completely silent, save for the faint sound of wind moving through the trees lining Miller Street. Even the birds seemed to have quieted, as though sensing the importance of the moment. Many years ago, Cole began, I was sent to serve in a region far from home, a place where medical resources were limited, and the days often blended together into one long, exhausting stretch of time. The field hospital where Clara worked was not a large facility. It was a modest set of tents and temporary structures, staffed by a small group of doctors and nurses who worked far beyond what should have been expected of them. He paused, glancing at Clara, who stood quietly beside him, her eyes distant as the memories continued to surface. There were nights when the number of patients arriving exceeded anything the staff could reasonably handle, Cole continued. Supplies ran low. Sleep became a luxury few could afford. Yet Clara and her fellow nurses never once turned anyone away. They worked through exhaustion that would have broken most people, driven by nothing more than a sense of duty and compassion. The crowd listened intently, many of them leaning forward slightly, as though trying to absorb every word. Harold Finch had stepped fully out of his store, letting the door swing shut behind him, no longer concerned about customers who might wander in during business hours. Margaret Hale stood with her hands clasped tightly together, her eyes fixed on Clara with newfound admiration. "The night I arrived," Cole said, "I was brought in along with several others. I remember very little from those first few hours, only fragments, bright lights, urgent voices, the sound of someone calling for more supplies that were already running low. But I remember one voice clearly, calm and steady, even amid the chaos. That voice belonged to Clara." He turned to look at her, his expression softening. "She told me later that she had already been awake for nearly 2 days straight by the time I arrived. Her hands should have been trembling from fatigue, yet somehow they remained steady enough to do what needed to be done. She moved from patient to patient without pause, offering comfort in the smallest ways. A gentle word, a reassuring touch, even when there was little time for anything more." Clara felt her throat tighten as she listened to Cole recount the memory, pieces of it returning to her mind with startling clarity. She remembered the weight of exhaustion pressing down on her shoulders, remembered forcing herself to keep moving because she knew that stopping, even for a moment, could mean the difference between life and loss for someone depending on her. "There was a point that night," Cole continued, his voice growing quieter, "when the situation looked especially difficult for me. Resources were stretched so thin that difficult decisions had to be made about where to focus attention. I remember hearing a senior doctor suggest that time might be better spent elsewhere. But Clara refused to accept that answer. She stayed by my side, insisting that she was not ready to give up, not as long as there was still a chance." He glanced at the soldiers standing behind him, several of whom nodded solemnly, having clearly heard this story before, perhaps many times, from their captain himself. "She worked through the rest of that night without rest," Cole said. "I remember drifting in and out of awareness, but every time I opened my eyes, she was there, speaking softly, encouraging me to keep breathing, to keep holding on. She told me about her family back home, about a young son who was waiting for her, hoping perhaps that hearing about ordinary life might give me something to hold on to beyond the pain." Clara wiped at her eyes, the memory now fully formed in her mind. She remembered the fear in the young soldier's eyes, remembered making a quiet promise to herself that she would not let him become another loss on a night that had already claimed more than she wanted to count. "By morning," Cole said, against what many believed possible, "I was still breathing." Clara had stayed by my side the entire night, never once leaving to rest, never once allowing herself the comfort of stepping away. When I finally regained enough strength to speak clearly, the first thing I said to her was thank you. She simply smiled and told me it was her job, nothing more. He paused, letting the weight of the words settle over the crowd. But it was not simply her job. It was something far greater than that. It was a choice she made, night after night, to give everything she had to people she had never met, people whose names she often did not even know, until after they had already been treated. That kind of dedication is rare. It leaves a mark on the people who receive it, a mark that does not fade with time. The crowd remained silent, many faces etched with quiet emotion. Daniel stood near the front now, having moved closer during the telling of the story, his eyes fixed on his mother with a look of profound pride mixed with something closer to awe. He had always respected her work, but hearing the details laid out so clearly, in front of so many witnesses, gave him a new understanding of the strength she carried quietly within her. "After I recovered enough to be transferred elsewhere for further care," Cole continued, "I lost track of Clara for many years. Records from that time were often incomplete, and staff rotated frequently between different locations. I carried her memory with me throughout the rest of my service, often thinking back to that night whenever I faced difficult moments of my own. Her example became something I tried to live up to, a standard of dedication and compassion that shaped the kind of leader I hope to become." He turned toward Oliver Grant, gesturing for him to step forward once more. Oliver has a similar story, though the details differ slightly. I think it's important for the town to hear from more than one voice, so they understand this was not a single act of kindness, but a pattern of dedication that repeated itself night after night. Oliver stepped forward, his voice steadier now than it had been earlier. "I was much younger when I arrived at that same field hospital," he began. "Barely out of training, more frightened than I wanted to admit. The night I was brought in, I remember feeling completely overwhelmed by the chaos around me. But Clara noticed how frightened I was, and instead of simply treating my injuries, she took a moment to speak with me directly, calming my fears before continuing with her work." He glanced at Clara with a grateful smile. "She told me that fear was normal, that even the strongest people feel afraid in difficult moments, but that fear did not have to control what happened next." Those words stayed with me long after I recovered. They shaped the way I approached difficult situations throughout the rest of my service. Clara listened to both accounts with a growing sense of humility. She had never considered herself extraordinary. She had simply done what she believed needed to be done, treating each patient with the same care and attention, regardless of the circumstances surrounding them. Hearing her actions described so vividly, through the eyes of the people she had helped, stirred something deep within her, a quiet recognition of the impact she had made without ever fully realizing it at the time. Captain Cole turned back to the crowd, his voice growing firm and clear. "There are countless other stories like these, spread among doctors and nurses who served during that difficult period, many of whom never received the recognition they deserved. Today, we wanted to make sure that at least one of them, someone who has quietly continued her work here in this town, without ever seeking praise, finally received the acknowledgement she has long deserved." He reached into the folder Oliver had been holding earlier and pulled out a small stack of papers, each one bearing official markings. These documents contain formal commendations, recognizing Clara's service and the impact she made during her time at that field hospital. They have been prepared for quite some time, waiting for the moment we finally located her. Clara stared at the papers, her hands trembling slightly as Cole extended them toward her. She had never imagined that her quiet, exhausting work from all those years ago would one day return to her in such a public and meaningful way. "I don't know what to say," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You don't need to say anything," Cole replied gently. "Simply accept what you have earned. You gave so much to so many people without ever asking for anything in return. Today, we are simply here to make sure that gift is finally recognized." The crowd erupted into a quiet murmur of admiration, many neighbors exchanging glances filled with newfound respect for the woman they had known for years without ever truly understanding the depth of her past. Margaret Hale stepped forward and gently placed a hand on Clara's shoulder, her eyes glistening with tears of pride. "We had no idea," Margaret said softly. "All these years, and we had no idea what you carried with you." Clara managed a small, grateful smile, though the weight of the moment still pressed heavily on her chest. She looked toward her son, who stood watching her, with an expression of quiet awe, and felt a surge of emotion rise within her, a mixture of pride, humility, and something close to relief, as though a chapter of her life she had kept hidden for so long had finally found the light it deserved. Captain Cole straightened his posture once more, glancing at the soldiers standing behind him, before turning back to Clara with a final, solemn nod. "There is still more we would like to share with this town, and with you, before the day is done. What you did back then deserves to be remembered properly, not just through words, but through actions that honor the sacrifice you made." Clara nodded slowly, sensing that the morning's revelations were far from over, and that the quiet life she had built for herself in this small town was about to be forever changed by the truth finally stepping into the light. Word of what had happened on Miller Street spread through the town faster than anyone could have predicted. By mid-morning, people who had not witnessed the scene themselves were already hearing about it from neighbors, from shopkeepers, from anyone who had happened to be nearby when the soldiers arrived. The story passed from one person to another, gathering small details and losing others, until it became something closer to legend than ordinary news. Inside the hospital, Dr. Ellen Brooks stood near the reception desk, staring out the window at the crowd still gathered outside. She had worked alongside Clara for nearly 6 years, sharing countless long shifts and difficult nights, yet she had never heard even a hint of the story now unfolding in the street. She turned to one of the younger nurses standing nearby, her expression caught somewhere between disbelief and quiet pride. "Did you know about any of this?" Ellen asked. The younger nurse shook her head. "Not a word. Clara never talks about her past. I always assumed she just worked at a hospital somewhere else before coming here." Ellen glanced back toward the window, watching as the crowd continued to grow. "She's the calmest person I've ever worked with," she said softly. "No matter how chaotic things get, she never loses her composure. I always wondered where that steadiness came from. Now I suppose I understand a little better." Outside, Captain Cole had stepped aside briefly to speak quietly with his fellow soldiers, allowing Clara a moment to gather herself amid the emotional weight of the morning. Daniel moved closer to his mother, his voice gentle as he broke the silence between them. "Mom," he said, "why didn't you ever tell me any of this?" Clara turned to him, her eyes still glistening from the emotion of the past hour. "It wasn't something I wanted to bring into our home," she said. "Those years were difficult, Daniel. I saw things no person should have to see, and I carried burdens I didn't want you to carry alongside me. I wanted our life together to be peaceful, free from the weight of what I had left behind." Daniel considered her words carefully, his young mind working to reconcile the mother he had always known, with the woman now being celebrated by an entire unit of soldiers. "I always knew you were strong," he said finally. "I just didn't know how strong." Clara reached out and gently squeezed his hand, grateful for his understanding, even as the reality of her exposed past continued to settle over her like an unfamiliar weight. Captain Cole returned to where Clara and Daniel stood, his expression thoughtful. "There is something else I would like to share, if you're willing to hear it," he said. "It concerns what happened after I recovered, and how your actions that night influenced far more than just my own life." Clara nodded, bracing herself for whatever revelation awaited. "After my recovery," Cole continued, "I made a decision to continue serving, in part because of the example you set for me. I eventually rose through the ranks, and along the way, I made it a point to train the soldiers under my command with the same values you demonstrated that night: dedication, patience, and an unwillingness to give up on anyone, regardless of how difficult the circumstances became." He gestured toward the line of soldiers still standing nearby. "Every person in this unit has heard your story at some point during their training. Some of them joined this unit specifically because they wanted to serve alongside people who valued those principles. In many ways, your actions that night created a ripple effect that extended far beyond the walls of that field hospital." Clara felt a fresh wave of emotion rise within her, the realization slowly settling in that her quiet, exhausting work from years ago had shaped not only Cole's life, but the lives of countless others who had never even met her directly. "I never imagined something like that," she said softly. "I was simply trying to survive each night, trying to help as many people as I could." "That is exactly why it mattered so much," Cole replied. "You weren't seeking recognition or influence. You were simply doing what you believed was right, even when it cost you everything you had to give. That kind of quiet dedication has a way of shaping the world far beyond what the person doing it ever realizes." The crowd around them had grown even larger by now, drawing the attention of local reporters who had begun arriving with cameras and notepads, eager to capture the unfolding story. Sheriff Walter Doyle moved through the crowd, gently encouraging people to give Clara and the soldiers a bit more space, though his own curiosity clearly matched that of everyone else present. Margaret Hale, still standing close to Clara, turned to a small group of neighbors gathered nearby. "All these years," she said, shaking her head slowly, "she would bring soup to my door when I was sick, help carry groceries for the Pruitt family down the street, and never once mention any of this. I always thought she was simply a kind woman. I had no idea she carried something so extraordinary within her." George Pruitt, an older resident who had lived on Miller Street for decades, nodded in agreement. "She helped my wife through a difficult illness a few years back," he said. "Never asked for anything, never made a fuss about it, just quietly did what needed to be done, the same way these soldiers are describing." The stories began to multiply among the townspeople, each neighbor recalling small, quiet acts of kindness Clara had performed over the years, moments that had seemed unremarkable at the time, but now took on a deeper significance in light of the morning's revelations. It became clear that the same dedication she had shown on that distant battlefield had never truly left her. It had simply continued, quietly, within the ordinary rhythms of small-town life. Captain Cole listened to the murmuring crowd with a small, satisfied smile. "This is exactly the kind of thing I hoped this town would come to understand," he said, turning back to Clara. "Your dedication didn't end when you left that field hospital. It followed you here, into every part of your life since then." Clara felt her cheeks flush with humility. "I never thought of it that way," she admitted. "I suppose I simply continued doing what felt natural to me." "That is precisely the point," Cole said. "For some people, kindness and dedication are simply part of who they are, so deeply woven into their character that they hardly notice themselves doing it. But for those who receive it, the impact is unmistakable." As the morning continued, more soldiers stepped forward, each sharing brief but meaningful accounts of how Clara's actions, or the values she represented, had shaped their own journeys. Some had never met her directly but had heard her story through Cole or through others in their unit, and had drawn inspiration from it during their most difficult moments of service. One soldier, a quiet young woman named Isla Bennett, stepped forward hesitantly. "I never had the chance to meet you in person," she said, addressing Clara directly. "But I heard your story during a particularly difficult stretch of my own training, at a time when I was seriously considering giving up. Hearing about what you did that night, how you refused to abandon someone even when everyone around you had lost hope, gave me the strength to keep going." Clara's eyes filled with fresh tears as she listened to Isla's words. She had never imagined that her actions from so long ago could ripple outward in such unexpected ways, touching the lives of people she had never even met. "Thank you for telling me that," Clara said softly. "It means more to me than you know." As the stories continued, the crowd's initial shock slowly transformed into something closer to quiet reverence. Neighbors who had known Clara for years exchanged glances filled with newfound respect, many of them reconsidering the countless small interactions they had shared with her over time, now understanding the depth of character behind her humble demeanor. Captain Cole eventually raised his hand gently, signaling for quiet among the gathered soldiers and townspeople. "There is one more thing we would like to do today," he said, turning toward Clara with a solemn expression. "Something we have been planning for quite some time, ever since we finally located you." Clara felt her heart quicken, uncertain what more could possibly follow the outpouring of emotion and gratitude she had already experienced that morning. She glanced at her son, who offered her a reassuring smile, and then back at Captain Cole, bracing herself for whatever awaited. "Please," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion still swirling within her. "Tell me what you have planned." Cole nodded, glancing briefly at his fellow soldiers before turning back to address both Clara and the gathered crowd, ready to reveal the final gesture they had traveled so far to deliver, a gesture meant to honor not only Clara's past, but the quiet, unwavering dedication she had continued to show every single day since. Captain Cole turned toward one of the black vehicles parked at the edge of the street and gave a small signal. A soldier stepped out, carrying a long, flat wooden case in both hands, moving carefully, as though the contents inside required the utmost respect. He walked forward and stood beside Cole, holding the case steady, while the captain addressed the crowd once more. "Word of Clara's actions eventually reached higher levels of command," Cole explained. "It took years for the proper paperwork to be processed, partly because records from that time were incomplete, and partly because Clara herself never filed any claims or requests for recognition. When we finally pieced together enough information to confirm her identity and her contributions, a formal commendation was approved, along with an official medal recognizing her extraordinary service." He nodded to the soldier holding the case, who carefully opened it to reveal a medal resting against dark fabric, its surface catching the soft morning light. The crowd let out a collective gasp, many neighbors leaning forward for a better look, their expressions a mixture of astonishment and pride. Clara stared at the medal, her breath catching in her throat. She had never imagined that her quiet, exhausting work from all those years ago would one day be honored in such a formal and public manner. "This medal represents more than just recognition for a single night," Cole said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent street. "It represents years of dedication, sacrifice, and compassion, shown not only during your time at that field hospital, but throughout your continued service to this community since then. It is long overdue, but we are honored to finally present it to you." He lifted the medal carefully from its case and stepped closer to Clara. She stood still, her hands trembling slightly, as Cole gently placed the medal around her neck, the weight of it settling against her chest, like a quiet confirmation of everything she had given throughout her life, without ever expecting anything in return. The crowd erupted into applause, the sound rolling down Miller Street and echoing off the storefronts and houses lining the road. Margaret Hale wiped tears from her eyes, applauding enthusiastically alongside her neighbors. Harold Finch clapped from his doorway, a broad smile spreading across his face. Even Sheriff Walter Doyle, usually composed and reserved, allowed himself a proud smile as he watched the scene unfold. Daniel stepped forward through the crowd, unable to hold back any longer, and wrapped his arms around his mother in a tight embrace. Clara held him close, tears finally spilling freely down her cheeks as the emotional weight of the morning fully settled over her. "I'm so proud of you, Mom," Daniel whispered against her shoulder. "I always knew you were special, but I never understood just how much you've given, to so many people, for so long." Clara pulled back slightly, cupping her son's face gently in her hands. "Everything I did so that you would grow up in a world a little kinder than the one I sometimes had to face," she said softly. "I never wanted recognition for it. I just wanted to make sure the people around me were cared for, the same way I hope you will always care for others." Daniel nodded, his own eyes glistening with emotion, understanding now more deeply than ever the values his mother had quietly instilled in him throughout his life. Captain Cole allowed the applause to settle before speaking once more, his voice steady and clear. "Before we leave today, there is one final gesture we would like to make, something small in comparison to everything Clara has given, but meaningful nonetheless." He turned to Oliver Grant, who stepped forward carrying a small, neatly wrapped box. Cole took the box and presented it to Clara with both hands, his expression warm despite the formality of the moment. "Inside this box," Cole explained, "you will find letters written by soldiers who served alongside me over the years, many of whom heard your story during difficult moments of their own training or service. Each letter expresses gratitude, not necessarily for anything you did for them directly, but for the example you set, an example that helped shape the kind of people they became." Clara accepted the box carefully, her hands trembling as she lifted the lid to find a stack of folded letters resting inside, each one written in different handwriting, each one carrying its own quiet story of gratitude and inspiration. "I don't know how to properly thank you for this," Clara said, her voice thick with emotion. "All of you. For remembering, for coming here today, for sharing these stories with me and with this town." "You don't need to thank us," Cole replied gently. "If anything, the gratitude flows in the opposite direction. You gave so much of yourself during some of the most difficult years of your life, without ever seeking recognition or reward. Today was simply our way of making sure that dedication finally received the acknowledgement it deserved." The crowd remained gathered for a while longer, many neighbors approaching Clara individually to offer their own words of admiration and gratitude. Margaret Hale hugged her tightly, whispering how proud she was to call her a friend. Harold Finch shook her hand firmly, insisting that her next visit to his store would be entirely free of charge, a gesture Clara gently declined with a small, grateful laugh. As the crowd slowly began to disperse, returning to their ordinary routines with a newfound sense of appreciation for the quiet nurse who had lived among them for so many years, Captain Cole approached Clara once more, his expression softening into something more personal and less formal. "I meant what I said earlier," he told her. "You gave me a second chance at life, and everything I have accomplished since then exists because of the strength you showed that night. I hope you understand just how far your actions have traveled, touching lives you never even knew about." Clara reached out and gently placed her hand on his arm. "Thank you for finding me," she said, "for giving me the chance to understand the full impact of something I never fully realized at the time. I will carry this moment with me for the rest of my life." Cole nodded, a warm smile finally breaking through his composed exterior. "As will we," he said, "all of us." The soldiers began returning to their vehicles, preparing for their departure, though several of them paused briefly to offer Clara a final respectful nod before climbing aboard. Isla Bennett was among the last to leave, pausing beside Clara with a small, grateful smile. Thank you again, Isla said, for everything, even the parts you never realized you were giving. Clara squeezed her hand gently. Thank you for telling me, she replied, for letting me understand the difference it made. As the trucks began to pull away, the street slowly returned to its familiar quiet, though the atmosphere felt undeniably different from the ordinary calm that usually settled over Miller Street. Neighbors lingered a little longer than usual, exchanging quiet conversations about everything they had witnessed and learned that morning. Clara stood beside her son, watching the convoy disappear around the corner, the medal still resting gently against her chest, the box of letters held carefully in her hands. Daniel wrapped his arm around her shoulders, and together they began walking back toward their home, the same walk they had taken countless times before, though today it felt profoundly different. Are you going to read all those letters? Daniel asked as they walked. Clara smiled softly, glancing down at the box in her hands. Eventually, she said, but not today. Today, I think I just want to sit with everything that happened, and remember why I chose this path in the first place. Daniel nodded, understanding the quiet need for reflection that lingered in his mother's voice. You know, he said after a moment, I think I understand now why you never talked about it. It wasn't because you were ashamed or trying to hide something. You just didn't want it to define you more than the simple, everyday kindness you show all the time. Clara looked at her son, surprised by the depth of his insight. That's exactly right, she said softly. The uniform, the medals, the formal recognition, none of that ever mattered as much to me as simply being able to help the people in front of me, whether that meant treating a soldier on a difficult night or bringing soup to a sick neighbor down the street. They reached their home just as the last of the crowd finally dispersed from Miller Street, the town slowly settling back into its familiar rhythm, though changed in a quiet, meaningful way that would linger in conversations for weeks to come. In the days that followed, word of what happened continued to spread throughout the wider region, drawing quiet admiration from people who had never even met Clara personally. The local newspaper ran a modest article about the event, careful to respect Clara's evident preference for humility over attention. The hospital where she worked held a small, private gathering among her colleagues, offering their own heartfelt congratulations for a chapter of her life they had never known existed. Clara continued working her regular shifts at the hospital, treating patients with the same quiet dedication she always had, though now, occasionally, a patient or a colleague would glance at her with a flicker of newfound recognition, having heard the story that had briefly transformed their small town's ordinary morning into something extraordinary. Despite the attention, Clara remained largely unchanged, continuing to live simply and quietly, focused on her work and on raising her son with the same values that had guided her throughout her own life. The medal found a quiet place in a drawer at home, not hidden away out of shame, but kept close in a way that honored its significance without allowing it to overshadow the daily acts of kindness that had always defined her. Occasionally, in the evenings, she would take out the box of letters Cole had given her, reading one or two at a time, allowing herself to absorb the full weight of the impact she had made without ever fully realizing it during the difficult years when she had simply been trying to survive each exhausting shift. Daniel often sat beside her during these quiet evenings, listening as she read portions of the letters aloud, gaining a deeper understanding of his mother's quiet strength with each passing story. He found himself carrying those lessons into his own life, treating others with the same patience and compassion his mother had always modeled, even during the moments when she thought no one was watching closely enough to notice. The town of Miller Street never forgot the morning the soldiers arrived, calling their quiet nurse ma'am with such solemn respect. It became a story passed down among neighbors for years afterward, a reminder that even the most ordinary lives often carry extraordinary chapters hidden quietly beneath the surface, waiting patiently for the right moment to finally be seen. And for Clara, though the recognition had been humbling and unexpected, what mattered most remained unchanged. She continued to wake each morning, ready to care for whoever needed her, driven not by medals or formal acknowledgement, but by the same quiet, steady compassion that had guided her through every difficult night and every ordinary day throughout her entire life.